Hello there. Welcome to my bedtime story. Tonight I will be reading the first two chapters of the book Gooney Bird Greene by Lois Lowry. This was a childhood favorite of mine, so I hope you will enjoy it as much as I did. There was a new student in Water Tower Elementary School. She arrived in October after the first month of school had already passed. She opened the second grade classroom door at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning and appeared there all alone without even a mother to introduce her. She was wearing pajamas and cowboy boots and was holding a dictionary in her lunchbox. "Hello, Miss Pigeon," the second grade teacher said. "We're in the middle of our spelling lesson." "Good," said the girl in pajamas. "I brought my dictionary. Where's my desk?" "Who are you?" Miss Pigeon asked politely. "I'm your new student. My name is Gooney Bird Greene," that's a green with the sound E at the end, "and I just moved here from China. I want a desk right smack in the middle of the room because I like to be right smack in the middle of everything." The class stared at the new girl with admiration. They had never met anyone like Gooney Bird Greene. She was a good student. She sat down at the desk Miss Pigeon provided, right smack in the middle of everything, and began doing second grade spelling. She did all of her work neatly and quickly, and she followed instructions. But it soon was clear that Gooney Bird was mysterious and interesting. Her clothes were unusual. Her hairstyles were unusual. Even her lunches were very unusual. At lunchtime on Wednesday, her first day in school, she opened her lunchbox and brought out sushi and a pair of bright green chopsticks. On Thursday, her second day of Water Tower Elementary School, Gooney Bird Greene was wearing a bright pink ballet tutu over green stretch pants, and she had 3 small red grapes, an avocado, and an oatmeal cookie for lunch. On Thursday afternoon, after lunch, Miss Pigeon stood in front of the class with a piece of chalk in her hand. "Today," she said, "we are going to continue talking about stories." "Yay!" the second graders said in very loud voices, all but Felicia Ann, who never spoke, and Malcolm, who wasn't paying attention. He was under his desk, as usual. "Gooney Bird, you weren't here for the first month of school, but our class has been learning about what makes good stories, haven't we?" Miss Pigeon said. Everyone nodded, all but Malcolm, who was under his desk doing something with scissors. "Class, what does a story need most of all? Who remembers?" Miss Pigeon had her chalk hand in the air, ready to write something on the board. The children were silent for a minute. They were thinking. Finally, Chelsea raised her hand. "Chelsea, what does a story need?" "A book," Chelsea said. Miss Pigeon put her chalk hand down. "There are many stories that don't need a book," she said pleasantly. "Aren't there, class? If your grandma tells you a story about when she was a little girl, she doesn't have that story in a book, does she?" The class stared at her, all but Malcolm, who was still under his desk, and Felicia Ann, who always looked at the floor, never raised her hand, and never spoke. Beanie said, "My grandma lives in Boston." Kiko said, "My grandma lives in Honolulu." Ben said loudly, "My grandma lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania." Tricia shouted, "My grandma is very rich." "Class," said Miss Pigeon. "Shh." Then, in quieter voice, she explained, "Another time we will talk about our families, but right now," she stopped talking and looked at Barry Tuckerman. Barry was on his knees in his seat, and his hand was waving in the air as hard as he could make it wave. "Barry," Miss Pigeon said, "do you have something that you simply have to say, something that cannot possibly wait?" Barry nodded yes. His hand waved. "And what is so important?" Barry stood up beside his desk. Barry Tuckerman liked to make very important speeches, and they always required that he stand. "My grandma," Barry Tuckerman said, "went to jail once. She was 20 years old and she went to jail for civil disobedience." Then Barry sat down. "Thank you, Barry. Now look at what I'm writing on the board. Who can read this word?" Everyone, all but Malcolm and Felicia Ann, watched as she began to write the long word. Then they shouted out, "Beginning!" "Good," said Miss Pigeon. "Now I'm sure you all know this one," she wrote again. "Middle!" the children shouted. "Good. And can you guess what this last word will be?" She held up her chalk and waited. "End." "Correct," Miss Pigeon said. "Good for you, second graders. Those are the parts a story needs: a beginning, middle, and an end." Now I'm going to write another very long word on the board. Let's see what good readers you are. She wrote a C, then an H. "Miss Pigeon," someone called. She wrote an A and then an R. "Miss Pigeon," several children were calling now. She turned to see what was so important. Malcolm was sitting beside his desk. He was crying. "Malcolm needs to go to the nurse, Miss Pigeon," Beanie said. Miss Pigeon went to Malcolm and knelt beside him. "What's the trouble, Malcolm?" she asked. But he couldn't stop crying. I know," Nicholas said. Nicholas always knew everything, and his desk was beside Malcolm's. "Tell me, Nicholas. Remember Kiko showed us how to make origami stars?" All of the second graders reached into their desks and their pockets and their lunch boxes. There were tiny stars everywhere. Kiko had shown how to make them origami stars out of small strips of paper. The stars were very easy to make. The school janitor had complained just last Friday that he was sweeping up hundreds of origami stars. "Malcolm put one in his nose," Nicholas said, "and now he can't get it out." "Is that correct, Malcolm?" Miss Pigeon asked. Malcolm nodded and wiped his eyes. "Don't sniff, Malcolm. Do not sniff. That is an order." She took his hands and walked him to the classroom door. She turned to the class. "Children," she said, "I'm going to be gone exactly for 1 minute and 30 seconds while I walk Malcolm to the nurse's office down the hall. Stay in your seats while I'm gone. Think about the word character. A character is what a story needs. When I come back from the nurse's office, we are going to create a story together. You must choose who the main character will be. Talk amongst yourself quietly. Think about interesting characters like Abraham Lincoln or perhaps Christopher Columbus or..." "Babe Ruth?" called Ben. "Yes, Babe Ruth is a possibility. I'll be right back." Miss Pigeon left the class with Malcolm. When she returned, 1 minute and 30 seconds later, without Malcolm, the class was waiting. They had been whispering all but Felicia Ann, who never whispered. "Have you chosen?" she asked. The class nodded. All of their heads went up and down except Felicia Ann's, because she always looked at the floor. "And your choice is?" All of the children, all but Felicia Ann, called out together. "Gooney Bird Greene," they called. Miss Pigeon sighed. "Class, there are many different kinds of stories. There are stories about imaginary characters, like Dumbo," Tricia called out. "Raise your hand if you want to speak, please," Miss Pigeon said. "But yes, Tricia, you are correct. Dumbo is an imaginary character. There are also stories about real people from history, like Christopher Columbus," and she stopped. Barry Tuckerman was waving and waving his hand. "Yes, Barry, do you have something very important to say?" Barry Tuckerman stood up. He twisted the bottom of his shirt around in his fingers. "I forgot," he said at last. "Well, sit back down then, Barry. Now, I thought, class, that since Christopher Columbus's birthday is coming up soon..." She looked at Barry Tuckerman, whose hand was waving like a windmill once again. "Barry," she said. Barry Tuckerman stood up again. "We already know all the stories about Christopher Columbus," he said. "We want to hear a true story about Gooney Bird Greene." "Yes, Gooney Bird Greene," the class called. Miss Pigeon sighed again. "I'm afraid I don't know many facts about Gooney Bird Greene," she said. "I know a lot of facts about Christopher Columbus, though. Christopher Columbus was born in..." "We want Gooney Bird," the class chanted. "Gooney Bird," Miss Pigeon said finally. "How do you feel about this?" Gooney Bird Greene sat beside her desk in the middle of the room. "Can I tell the story?" she asked. "Can I be right smack in the middle of everything? Can I be the hero?" "Well, since you would be the main character," Miss Pigeon said, "I guess that would put you in the middle of everything. I guess that would make you the hero." "Good," Gooney Bird said. "I will tell you an absolutely true story about me." And that is the end of Chapter 1, so now we're heading into Chapter 2. Gooney Bird adjusted the pink ballet tutu she was wearing over a pair of green stretch pants. Her t-shirt was decorated with polka dots, her red hair was pulled into 2 pigtails and held there with blue scrunchies. She pulled carefully on one of her pigtails, rearranging it neatly because the scrunchie was coming loose. She felt her earlobes, which were small and pink and empty. "I should have worn the dangling diamond earrings I got from the prince," she told the class. "Maybe I'll wear them next week." "Diamond earrings? Prince?" Miss Pigeon asked. "Well, actually, the prince didn't give me the earrings. I got them at the palace," Gooney Bird explained. "Why were you at the palace?" "Well, first I was in jail, and then..." Gooney Bird interrupted herself. "It's a long story." She reached down and tidied her socks. "May I come up to the front of the room to begin?" she asked the teacher as she adjusted her clothes. "I like to be absolutely the center of attention." Miss Pigeon nodded and stepped aside, so there was room for Gooney Bird to stand in front of the class. "You might as well sit down, Miss Pigeon," Gooney Bird said politely. "Take a load off your feet." Miss Pigeon sat down in a chair behind her cluttered desk. She looked at the clock on the wall. "We have 15 minutes, she said, before arithmetic. "Class," Gooney Bird Greene said. "You heard Miss Pigeon. We have just 15 minutes. There are many Gooney Bird Greene stories I might tell you, but I have time for only one today. Who has a suggestion for a story?" Ben's hand shot up. "Tell us about how you came from China," he said. Nicholas called, "Why were you named Gooney Bird?" Chelsea was wiggling and wiggling her seat. "The palace," she said. "Tell about jail and the palace and the diamond earrings." All their hands were waving, but Gooney Bird motioned for those children to put their hands down. She looked around the room thinking. "This is the title of the story," she said at last. "How Gooney Bird Got Her Name." "Just like how the leopard got his spots," Barry Tuckerman said in a loud whisper. "Barry, pay attention, please," Gooney Bird said. "I like to have absolutely all eyes on me." Then, when the class was silent and all eyes, except for those of Felicia Ann, who always looked at the floor, were on her, she began. How Gooney Bird Got Her Name. Once upon a time, 8 years ago, a man and a woman named Mr. and Mrs. Greene, that's Greene with a silent E at the end, discovered that they were expecting a baby girl. The man's name was Gordon Greene. His wife was Barbara Greene. They decided to name their baby girl with their initials, G for Jordan, B for Barbara. They thought of many different names. "Gail Beth," said Miss Greene. She liked short names. Gwendolyn Belinda," said Mr. Greene. He liked long names. They discussed and discussed. They never argued or fought, but they had many discussions. Once in the middle of the night, Miss Greene woke up. She had a dream about a name. She nudged Mr. Greene until he woke up a little bit. Then she said, "Georgina Babette." "No," he said, and went back to sleep. One night Mr. Greene woke up, nudged his wife, and told her he had a dream. "Gazpacho banana," he said. That was a nightmare you had, his wife said. He agreed. They both went back to sleep. Finally, because they could not make up their minds about a name, they decided they would wait until the baby girl was born. Then they would look at the baby and somehow they would know her name should be Grace Bridget or Gloria Bonnie or some other name. They waited and waited for the child's birth. It takes many months, as you know. Gooney Bird paused in her story. She could see that many of the children wanted to wave their hands in the air and say things. Class, she said, any comments so far? Any questions? We have 9 minutes left, Miss Pigeon reminded her before arithmetic. Kiko asked in a small voice, did he really say gazpacho banana? Yes, he did, Gooney Bird said. I only tell absolutely true stories. Barry Tuckerman stood up beside his desk. I was named a B name for my grandfather, he said. My grandfather's name was Benjamin. That's my name, Ben called out. My grandfather was in college when my grandmother went to jail, Barry added, or he would have gone with her. Tricia raised her hand. My cat's name is Fluffernutter, she said. 4 more minutes, Miss Pigeon announced. Let's get Gooney Bird back to her story so we can hear that ending. Did you notice, class, she added, how she used characters and dialogue, and her story is full of suspense. It's a cliffhanger, isn't it? What a good storyteller Gooney Bird is. Ready? Gooney Bird asked the class. Ready, shouted the class, all but Felicia Ann, who never shouted. Okay, here comes the ending. Finally, one spring morning, the baby girl was born. She weighed 6 pounds and 14 ounces. She had red hair. Look, said her mother. She wiggles her head around looking for food when she's hungry. Isn't that cute? It reminds me of something, but I forgot what. Her father peered down at the new baby in his wife's arms. He smiled. She has very big feet. Isn't that cute? It reminds me of something, but I forget what. Mr. and Mrs. Greene looked at their sweet baby. They thought and thought. It's coming to me, Mr. Greene said at last. Do you remember when we went on that bird-watching trip to various islands in the Pacific Ocean where we saw all kinds of marine birds? That's it, his wife said. She looks very much like one of those birds, but which one? Let's get our photograph album from that trip, Mr. Greene said. Together they turned the pages of the album. Double-crested cormorant, Miss Greene said. They looked down at the baby. No, she didn't look like a double-crested cormorant. Red-necked grebe, Miss Greene suggested. They looked at the baby again. She does have a red neck, Mr. Greene said. She does not, said Miss Greene. It's pink. They turned the pages some more. Suddenly they both said, oh. Very carefully they looked at the photograph. They very carefully looked at the baby. Big feet, Mr. Greene said, just like our babies. A head that bobs around, Miss Greene said, just like our babies. That's the one, they agreed. They read the label under the photograph. Lace and Albatross, the label said. I don't think Lace and Albatross Green is a very pretty name for a baby girl, Miss Greene said sadly. It sounds too scientific. I agree, Mr. Greene said, but look at the small print. Mr. and Mrs. Greene read the words in small print of, often called Gooney Bird. Gooney Bird Greene, they said. I like the sound of it, Mrs. Greene said. It has a G and a B. It does indeed, said Mr. Greene. So they decided to name their baby girl Gooney Bird Greene. Then everyone, including a doctor, a midwife, and a cleaning lady, hugged and kissed and did Vienna's waltz together. The end. What a lovely story, Miss Pigeon said, and it gives us a chance to do some science research. We will look up Lace and Albatross Encyclopedia. Thank you, Gooney Bird. You may take your seat now, and we'll turn to our arithmetic. Wait, Beanie's hand was waving in the air. Yes, Beanie? Miss Pigeon asked. What's wrong? I want to hear about the diamond earrings in the palace. That's a different story, Gooney Bird said. She was walking back to her desk. Tell it, the children called. Barry Tuckerman jumped up and stood beside his desk. I want to hear about how Gooney Bird came from China, he said. I came on a flying carpet, Gooney Bird said, but that's a different story, too. She adjusted her pink tutu and sat down. Tell it, the children called. Miss Pigeon laughed. I'm sure Gooney Bird was just joking about the prince in the palace and the diamond earrings, she said, and the flying carpet, too. Gooney Bird had already opened her arithmetic book. She looked up in surprise. No, she said, I wasn't joking. I only tell absolutely true stories. Well, said Miss Pigeon, will you tell us another tomorrow? Of course, Gooney Bird said. And that is the end of Chapter 2 and the end of our story time tonight. I will be posting more readings of this book in a playlist, so if you would like to continue listening, feel free to check that link in the description. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.